Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk with immigration attorney Brian D. Lerner. We are talking on this video about the new law, new regulations that aren't yet new and they're not yet finalized, but I've had so many people come into my office thinking that the procedure of the way that it is supposed to happen and what's going to happen are just two different things. I thought I would do a video on this subject in order to clarify what the new regulations are, who it's going to help, how it's going to help you, and what the procedures are in order to go forward with this particular matter. Now, first of all, let me just clarify which one I'm talking about because, obviously there's a lot of new laws, new regulations that are coming out all the time. And this one that I'm talking about is the biggest one that has come out in a long time. It is the most in favor of immigrants since, in my opinion, since 1996. And it's an excellent step forward to helping those who have no other realistic way to go. Now, in order to understand the new law, what will become the new regulations, first we need to determine what the old regulations are. Just a minute, my cell phone's ringing. Okay. So the way that will happen is like this. Let me just give you an example. Person A, spouse, marries, who's a U.S. citizen, has married someone who's not a U.S. citizen and is here in the United States illegally. The question is whether or not that person who's illegal, number one, has to leave the country, number two, how the new law might affect them, and number three, whether they can adjust status in the U.S. or not. Now, normally, under the current law, the way it is there's basically two types of petitions that have to go forward. The first petition is what's called consulate processing. Now, imagine that you, the U.S. citizen, are here in the United States and your spouse is over in Mexico or wherever they happen to be. And the consulate processing petition goes forward, does what it needs to do, and ultimately your spouse would come into the United States as a lawful permanent resident. Now, there's a little bit of an issue here in that your spouse is already in the United States but here illegally. Now, assuming that they would have to leave, again, the way the normal current law works is they would leave to go to the interview at the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Consulate, and once they leave, because they've been out of status here for over a year, they are then subject to what's called the 10-year bar, meaning that they can't come back for 10 years. Now, the question is, how do you get around that? Well, normally a waiver, it's called a waiver of the 10-year bar, could also be referred to as a pardon, is submitted, and once it is submitted, it would get ruled upon, and if it's approved, then the person, your spouse, who left the United States would be able to come back to the United States as a lawful permanent resident because theoretically the waiver would have been granted, so therefore there is no more 10-year bar and they're permitted to enter. Now, the way that it normally occurred, the way that it happens now, is that you can't submit the waiver until your spouse is sitting across the table from the officer in the foreign country. So let's just say it's Mexico. When they're in Ciudad Juarez and they're being interviewed, at the end of the interview, the officer finds out they need a waiver. They go, okay, here's the waiver. And the officer says, goodbye, talk to you in a year, 2 years, whatever it is. And then it'll take them a while to rule on it. And once they rule on it, assuming it would be approved, then they call you back and you're able to go back to the United States. So based upon that, people did not want to leave the United States because the first thing they say is, well, okay, I'm going to be subject to a 10-year bar the moment my fingertip goes outside the United States. And what happens if they don't approve the waiver? Then I'm stuck here for 10 years at least. What happens if they're going to approve it, but they're not going to approve it for a year or a year and a half or 2 years? Do I have to wait? in the foreign country, away from my kids, away from my spouse for all that time? Of course, the answer is yes. You would have had to have waited that entire time, even if they ultimately approve it, outside the United States. So the new regulations, which the final regulations have actually been proposed, and they're just waiting for a comment period, so hopefully they'll be finalized shortly. The new regulations change the manner in which the waiver is filed. I want to stress what it doesn't do, and then I'll elaborate more on the procedures. It does not make it so your spouse does not have to leave the U.S. Okay, I can't tell you how many people have come into my office thinking that everything now can be done inside the United States and they never have to leave. No, that's not what the regulations say. They're still going to have to leave the United States, but now the procedures are different. So let me now tell you what the new procedure is and how that changes from the old procedure. So you just heard the normal, typical way it's been since 1996 on how to normally submit the waiver. You leave the country, submit the waiver, wait outside, and hopefully it gets approved. Now, with the new regulations, you submit the waiver inside the United States to USCIS. And then, it obviously takes them time to rule upon it. But then, assuming that it's approved, you will then get a provisional grant of that waiver, okay? And what that means is then when it's time to go to your appointment, whether it's in the Philippines or Mexico or Korea or Canada, wherever it is, when you go to your appointment, you will now have basically a waiver that has been approved. So you know essentially that once you walk outside the country, you're not subject to the 10-year bar because you've already had it approved. So it's just a matter then of going through the normal visa processing through the consulate processing. So, they make sure the marriage is bona fide, they make sure you didn't have bad intent when you entered the U.S., all the normal things. So obviously, if that's the only issue, that's just a matter of proving the bona fides of the marriage. Then what happens? Everything goes smoothly and you come back. So instead of waiting outside the United States for a year or 2 years, or most importantly, having that fear that once you leave the United States, they may not even grant it, now you're not even going to leave the United States until you have a grant of that waiver from inside. Because the reality is, if they deny the waiver inside the United States, you're essentially going to do what you've been doing, which is not leave, and or you'll find another way. But assuming that the waiver is prepared correctly, and assuming that you have submitted it properly once the new regulations occur, you leave, and you go for 2-3 weeks, whatever it happens to be, and then you come back. You don't have to spend all that time away from your spouse. You don't have to spend all that time away from your kids. You don't have to wonder if it's going to be granted, because it'll be granted before you walk outside the United States. So the bottom line here is, yes, you still have to leave the United States, assuming you don't qualify for other matters. You still are subject to the 10-year bar, and you still cannot adjust in the United States, assuming all of the facts as I've stated. But the next best thing, you don't have to leave the United States until you get a formal approval of the waiver, and then once you leave, it's going to be for a very short period of time. So it is a very nice set of regulations that have come out that will help you, your family, your kids, because the reality is, many of the spouses, you've been here for years, you're working under the table, you're working at jobs that don't pay you hardly anything because you can't get a work permit, and now you can go forward with the procedure. You don't have to be afraid you're going to not be able to come back for 10 years. And then the next question people ask me is, well, when can we start? Well, theoretically, you can start now. Okay, you start the consulate processing, and that's going to take about a year to get an appointment at the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Consulate. The waiver is prepared, and then once the new regs come out in 2-3 months, you'll submit it the new way, not the old way, and then the idea is that you'll get the approval, hopefully, before you have to leave the United States, and if not, you'll just continue the appointment until you do get an answer. So The new regs are meant specifically so that families don't have to be torn apart for all this time. They don't have to, fear leaving the country now in anticipation that it might not be granted. Now, this is what it doesn't do. It doesn't make it easier to get the waiver, okay? So if people are thinking all they have to do is fill out a couple papers and send it to USCIS and boom, it's granted, that's not the case. Basically when my office prepares the waiver, we do the attorney cover letter, the declarations, affidavits, put all kinds of exhibits. I also recommend a psychologist that will interview the U.S. citizen spouse and see what hardship exists and show all the depression and all the normal hardship that's going to occur if you're separated for all this time. So the waiver still needs to be prepared correctly, and it needs to show the extreme hardship. So it still needs to get approved. Okay, so the mechanism for preparing the waiver hasn't changed at all. But next to being able to adjust in the U.S. and not leaving at all, this is the next best thing. It is a really nice change from the way it used to be. And if you're sitting there wondering, what to do and when to start, now would be a good time, at least to consult some immigration attorney in order to see what's going on. And if you need to call my office, I'll be happy to explain to you essentially what I just did, and also to see if maybe you qualify to adjust in the U.S. There are certain factors that I look for to see if you adjust, so maybe the waiver won't be needed at any rate. But as it stands, this is the new law, the new regulations that are going to come out, at least as anticipated. It looks like it'll take another 2-3 months, and then we'll go from there. So hopefully I've explained it so it's a lot clearer, and you'll be able to hopefully become a lawful permanent resident and a productive member of society thereafter. Okay, more on the coming videos.